a former ape, he has something shocking to tell those academics about the differences between apes and humans. And my aims are less shocking, although my audience, like his, is members of an academy. I am merely a literature professor who's retired, not an ape who has learned to speak. But like Kafka's ape, I wish to bring to the Academy's attention a few realities I think it may be being trained to misrecognize. And like Kafka's report, mine wonders if what passes for pedagogical light is not shot through with darkness. Do current educational priorities ignore something of great importance? And to pursue this question, I begin with the words of the US Department of Education. In an ever-changing, increasingly complex world, that department writes, it's more important than ever that our nation's youth are prepared to bring knowledge and skills to solve problems, make sense of information, and know how to gather and evaluate evidence to make decisions. This sentence is the opening salvo of their online statement about the importance of STEM courses in the curriculum. Subjectivity in this scheme of priorities takes a back seat. Indeed, subjectivity may be suspect territory. Certainly that's suggested by Wikipedia's definition of the term. Quote, a subject's personal perspective, feelings, beliefs, desires, or discovery, as opposed to those made from an independent, objective point of view. You members of this academy hear these priorities often. You may well use them to guide your curricular choices and prepare for the serious business of post-collegiate life that lies ahead. Subjectivity may be delightful. It's at any rate unavoidable, but you are probably not at college to indulge it. Your parents are probably not spending a fortune for you to immerse yourself in literature or languages or philosophy or art or music or religion. You are here rather to identify and pursue your objectives, those real things you plan to achieve, not those slippery things that remain open to interpretation, besmirched by feelings and desires. So what's wrong with this educational picture? A great deal, I'd like to claim. Let me start by putting you into the picture. In truth, no feelings, beliefs, desires can be assessed from an independent, objective point of view. As Nietzsche recognized long ago, all seeing is perspectival. It comes from somewhere. That's what makes it both interested, that is, angled, open to critique, and interesting, provocative. What you see from a particular locus. Point of view is by definition not objective. It is a point of view. We are always tacitly in the picture of the world that we carry into our claims and proposals. Non-subjective learning is obviously essential, and get as much STEM as you can. But that learning remains unavoidably at your disposal to be well used or ill used by you. Objects kill and maim in war, but it takes subjects to create, legitimize, and unleash these objects. Education begins and ends with the subject. Its inalienable aim is to inform and widen your subjectivity. And it does this in order to promote your greater understanding of that larger human world that we all inhabit. You bypass something essential, not merely the icing on the cake, if you put subjectivity on a back burner. To equate subjectivity with irresponsibility, to fantasize some human arena where subjectivity gets happily bypassed, transcended, is to dream of impossibilities. The realm of mortal, erring subjects is a space where the social world gets made and remade, and more, the ethical commitment of those who make and remake it is grounded in their own mortality. As Jacques Derrida puts it, it is from the sight of death as the place of my irreplaceability, that is, of my singularity, that I feel called to responsibility. In this sense, only a mortal can be responsible. Only a mortal can be responsible. Ethics is the task of living subjects, not of abstract systems. The mission of the Academy is only in part to promote a STEM education. At least as much, it is to enlarge the subjective resources of all the mortal subjects lucky enough to attend. Yes, though most of you are hardly 21, you're still mortal, here for a limited amount of time. College should make you wiser, more self-aware, and aware of others in their similarity and difference, and better prepared to use responsibly your allotment of time. That's my preamble. I'd like to explore some of the ways that literature sheds light on crucial yet disturbing subjective territory that the STEM enterprise ignores. I'll be talking about proclivities of the mind and of the body, how the mind's understanding is affected by communal or tribal orientations, as well as how the body's commerce with the mind is mediated, how the mind is affected by bodily events that may throw it off kilter and deposit it in an unmappable space that we sometimes call the uncanny. This is the territory that Kafka writes. And finally, I'll broach the mystery of human identity itself, how we move through space and time exposed to accident and surprise, and how we are unpredictably changed by these when they occur. This is the territory of most great literature. My main example will come from Sophocles, A Brief Nod to Shakespeare. By contrast, STEM has little interest in the tribe, in the uncanny, or ultimately in the human subject as such. For STEM, mysteries of the human subject get replaced by problems of the non-human object, and these are open to solutions. The subject carrying out STEM projects poses questions, but is not in question. The subject carrying out STEM projects is an unself-conscious Cartesian problem solver, map maker, information gatherer, evidence weigher, but not a mystery. STEM centers not on the problematic of the subject doing the work, but on the value of the work being pursued. The gaze of STEM is outward focused. There is a world out there endlessly in need of greater understanding, mapping, mastery. By contrast, literature seeks to shed a little light on the mystery of human beings themselves. And since we're all in that category, it could behoove us to pay attention. So I begin by examining fault lines, moments of exposure or stress in the mind-body bonding. For STEM, such fault lines are either non-existent or of little moment. The STEM subject assumes a functional relation between mind and body. The commanding mind is Lord and Master. The subservient body carries out the mind's commands. That's how research gets done. But many of you probably have experienced moments of sickness or of dread when this command structure falters and the body that is ours ceases to act like us. We normally think that nothing could be more immediate than our own body. In fact, we usually feel we are our bodies. Sometimes our body becomes mysterious, unforthcoming, no longer the faithful servant of our will. And at such moments, we stumble upon the uncanny. No STEM course will shed much light on the uncanny, but literature courses will. I am far from dismissing functional capacity. It is priceless and perhaps our signature human achievement. Indeed, the existential philosopher Rollo May proposed a basic linkage between coherent subjectivity itself and functional capacity. I is the I of I can, May insisted. The I cannot sustain itself without at least a remnant of capacity, of I can. We access our own identities by virtue of an abiding bodily canniness, a can-do-ness, however straitened it may be. And the repertory of embodied moves that we experience as given, ours beyond recall, serves as virtually our birthright. It underwrites our deepest intuitions of identity. Yet life, like literature, but unlike STEM, has its uncanny moments when this birthright fractures. And at such times, traffic between body and mind becomes strange. Some years ago, one of my colleagues, George, in the French department, was diagnosed with lung cancer. The cancer had metastasized before it was detected. He had little time left to live. A mutual friend and colleague, Bob, also in the French department, joined me in visiting George at the nearby hospital. He was undergoing intensive late-stage cancer treatment. He looked gaunt and spent when we entered his room. The procedures he was undergoing inflicted a good deal of pain. At a certain moment in our difficult conversation, he looked at me, smiled tightly, and said, "It's weird, there's no me anymore." He went on to explain that the racking pain inflicted by both the disease and its treatment had unraveled his sense of identity. He had become, at this last stage of his life, the object of a series of invasions, each overriding any power on his part to resist. Reduced to being a mere receptacle for these inhuman assaults, he no longer recognized himself as one who can, as George. Then somehow Bob managed to engage George in desultory shop talk. They began to recall a professional experience shared years earlier when they were interviewing a candidate for a position in 18th century literature. What I still remember, and it is now years since George's death, was a particular sentence George spoke in French. "Bob, tu te rappelles ce 18e, comment il s'appelait?" "Bob, you remember that 18th century specialist. What was his name?" I quote the French because 18e specialist in 18th century literature is a bit of a boutique word even for French ears. George spoke normally. His focus was clear, his eyes alert, looking at Bob and waiting for a response. The interview that had taken place years ago earlier was once more alive inside George's mind. It was giving pleasure on being revisited. I is the I of I can. George had for a moment repossessed himself as George who can. His recovery of subjective identity lasted only as long as he was able to relive an earlier vignette in which his agency, Bob's, and that of the 18th century specialist had all briefly operated in tandem. The interviewee had not been offered the job. Neither George nor Bob ever did come up with his name. A couple of minutes later, a nurse entered, wheeling in a slew of drugs that she needed to administer. George's face became drawn and gaunt once more, It was time to leave. He was no longer George. He died 2 weeks later. Our bodies, on the one hand, ours alone. No one else, as Derrida also reminds us, can die our death for us. On the other hand, our bodies only by way of an intricate subjective process that we rarely take into account. Here's the novelist Marcel Proust on our mind's attempt to understand another person. A real person, profoundly as we may sympathize with him, is in great measure perceptible only through our senses. That is to say, remains opaque, presents a dead weight which our sensibilities have not the strength to lift. If some misfortune comes to him, it is only in one small section of the complete idea we have of him that we are capable of feeling any emotion. Indeed, it is only in one small section of the complete idea he has of himself that he is capable of feeling any emotion either. This passage occurs about 100 pages into the first sub-novel of Proust's huge novel. And whenever I would teach Proust to undergraduates, I never failed to emphasize the passage. And my insistence was always surprising to my students. They tended to glide over the passage, totally unruffled by its claims. And yet its central assertion is quietly devastating, that we have no unmediated contact with others, embodied others. Our senses certainly register their physical presence. We straightaway see, hear, smell, or touch them, but we access them only by way of the cluster of ideas we carry inside and draw on to interpret those sense impressions. It's this subjective, interpretive frame that does the heavy lifting. It transforms the brute act of sensing bodies into the human one of reading persons. Not only, Proust goes on to claim, do we access others in this indirect mediated fashion, we move through the same kind of subjective mediation when accessing ourselves. And this latter claim defies common sense. I long remained dubious. Surely he's exaggerating, I thought. And then a crisis occurred in my own life many years ago, but still vivid. I was an assistant professor at the time, and I had become ill. A low-grade fever had settled in, accompanied by sharp pains pervasively located in my chest. My doctor was bewildered. My distress did not signal heart problems. So all he could do was throw aspirin, 2 at a time, 4 times a day, at it. Perhaps something was swollen and would shrink back to normal size, but neither the pain nor the fever diminished. So on a Wednesday afternoon, several weeks into my undiagnosed illness, I drove to an orthopedic specialist office several miles away, where I waited for hours to get my chest x-rayed. Finally, the x-rays were taken, and the radiologist, rather than explaining anything, ordered me to go to my regular doctor immediately, x-rays and report in hand. It was by then well past 6 p.m. I had 2 classes to teach the next day, but I reluctantly did as instructed. And my own doctor, luckily still in his office that late, looked at the x-rays and the report, and then told me to go to the nearest hospital emergency room that night. It seems I was having an attack of pulmonary embolism. I had never heard of this disease, and I remonstrated strongly. I didn't feel that bad, no worse than I had for some time now. I said I'd go to the hospital on Friday, to which he responded in more or less these words: pulmonary embolism is like a cluster of tiny bombs inside your lung. If any of them go off, you could die. You have to get to the ER as soon as possible. On hearing this, I felt nothing, not frightened, no feeling at all. I abstractly understood the words that had been said, but emotionally, it was as if they had been said to someone else. I drove home calmly, and as I got out of the car in our driveway, my wife came running toward me. She knew where I'd been, and it was very late to be getting home. I took one look at her panic-stricken eyes and burst into tears. This was the first moment, when I knew I might die that night. Proustian? Yes. The moment of the brute event and the moment of its subjective registering are separated in time. Proust's most harrowing instance of this is the death of the narrator's grandmother, a death that the boy is bodily present at, but one whose emotional weight it will take him another 2 years to grasp and make his own. In the subjective idea I still had of myself while driving home that night with the bad news, I was not yet threatened. But in the terrified eyes of my wife, I suddenly saw myself in mortal danger. We read even ourselves through the mirror of others. That is how feeling and thinking and identity come into play. Until this subjective activity occurs, we remain blank carriers rather than conscious sufferers of the misfortune that has come upon us. That personal vignette may join the one about George in suggesting how vexed can be the relation between our own physical body and our subjective grasp of it. Not merely that an unfamiliar, life-threatening illness had made its way into me, but that I was incapable of registering what was happening even after being told, until the moment when seeing my wife's distress released a kindred distress in me. It was intersubjective to the hilt. My menaced body only then became subjectively conceptualized, became mine. This strange trajectory seems to have been something Proust already knew. Literature's uncanny moments often zero in on how our bodies escape our ownership of them, how we are our bodies, but not the same as our bodies. And the something else that intervenes, seems to be in control, is our subjectivity. And it, oddly, is never simply ours. Kafka's The Metamorphosis opens on Gregor Samsa having just awakened after a night of fitful dreams to find himself turned into a gigantic insect. He is incapable of owning this transformation, of probing into how or why it might have happened. The problem he can access is simpler. It's a STEM problem of functionality, something to be solved. Given that he is now lying on his exoskeletal insect back on his bed in his locked bedroom, how will he manage to get out of bed, open the door, and make it to the office without being late? After rocking awkwardly from side to side, insects don't sleep on their backs, he succeeds in stumbling out of bed. Time now to open the locked door. Slowly, Gregor pushed the chair toward the door, then let go of it, caught hold of the door for support. The soles at the end of his little legs were somewhat sticky, and rested against it for a moment after his efforts. Then he set himself to turning the key in the lock with his mouth. It seemed unhappily that he hadn't really any teeth. What could he grip the key with? But on the other hand, his jaws were certainly very strong, and with their help, he did manage to set the key in motion, heedless of the fact that he was undoubtedly damaging them somewhere, since a brown fluid issued from his mouth, flowed over the key, and dripped on the floor. Everything here seethes with alienation. No creature in that body is equipped to achieve these things. Gregor cannot walk upright. Perhaps the most resonant moment of the story occurs a few pages later, when he falls onto his squirming little legs, feels immediate relief, and starts to scurry about his bedroom. He thus undoes, he repeats in reverse, the foundational story of Homo sapiens. That fateful moment when the infant first stands up, exiting from the world of horizontal beasthood and entering the one of vertical humanity. Every human designed feature of Gregor's habitation, the bed, the door, the key in the lock, gets transformed into dimensions of his bestial imprisonment. His body is no longer his, a fact emphasized by his incapacity to manage all those quivering legs. He can't even count them. No less than by that brown fluid issuing from the wound to his mouth. Brown. It no longer answers to the color of his own blood. And what possible interest could a STEM curriculum have in the work of Kafka? Kafka takes us somewhere far into the STEM enterprise of functional can-do, into a fantasy of one's own body becoming suddenly, inexplicably, the body of an enormous insect. So why would Kafka want us to go there? There are many answers to this question, and they are all outside the realm of STEM concerns. One answer would center on how poor Gregor never subjectively catches up to the drama of his body's metamorphosis. I at least grasped my own dilemma a half hour after I was told. All readers of Kafka's story register the appalling physical transformation that has taken place. But the quieter subjective drama is no less disturbing. Gregor cannot get his mind around what has happened to him. A second answer follows from this first one. He cannot get his mind around what has happened to him because his mind is not his anyway. The company he works for and the family he supports are the owners of his mind. They direct its functioning. Their priorities: will he get to work on time? Will his parents continue to recognize his fidelity? Come before his own. Keep him from having priorities of his own. And this second answer raises some scary questions. How do our minds get formed? What exterior institutions, economic, political, religious, domestic, educational, familial, are in the business of training our subjectivity so powerfully that we become incapable of acknowledging what the mirror plainly shows to be out there? As I claimed earlier, at uncanny moments, we are not the same as our own bodies. It turns out our minds are far more than merely ours as well. Kafka's work sheds light on how preposterous assessments may follow, not so much from avoiding the facts as from selecting a very particular subset of them, a subset skewed as much as required in order to keep intact our prior subjective training, our tribal alignments. Gregor's prior training allows him to see only his job at risk, his family perplexed. He cannot see his own transformation and cannot see it as a revelation about him. Kafka's story lets us grasp how subjectively skewed the act of seeing and assessing can be. How much more is at stake than just recognizing the facts? If you find this far-fetched, just consider those folks currently dying of COVID and rush to the hospital and desperately asking the doctor what is killing them. It can't be COVID. They know COVID is a left-wing conspiracy. It's right in front of them, but that's not them, can't be. This problem of assessment is troubling in ways that go beyond the late Senator Moynihan's well-known distinction between opinions and facts. You may remember Moynihan claimed that everyone is entitled to their opinions, but not their facts, as though the facts, neutral, disinterested, available, would all by themselves clarify the matter. But the facts never do all by themselves clarify the matter. There are always too many facts to choose among. And so a subset pertinent to sustaining one's prior alignment is located and chosen. The prior alignment guides the selection, which facts to cling to, which to ignore. Anyone who's had a political argument knows this. These are subjective dramas begging for critical analysis. A cage went in search of a bird, Kafka wrote, an aphorism that becomes more chilling the longer one broods on it. Kafka launches his aphorism by way of a surprise. This cage is not an inert object, but a living subject actively in search of something. If you are a cage, if you come to identify yourself as one and to act accordingly, then naturally, what you're looking for is a bird. Your training has informed you that they need to be enclosed, and you use your STEM set of skills to build inescapable cages. America builds more and larger cages than most other countries. President Trump has recently bragged about how comfortable the ones at the Mexican border are. STEM know-how gets the cages built, but a subjective mindset chooses what birds belong in them. Indeed, in the 1940s, the Nazis decided to build better and more elaborate cages yet, and made good on their decision. And more, they knew exactly what birds they were after. 19 years after Kafka's death, his three sisters ended up in the vast cage that was Auschwitz, where they were gassed to death. Their fate echoes Gregor's. He dies as a monstrous insect, while they were condemned as vermin in need of extermination. We arrive at a social drama in which ideological blinders, trained subjective leanings, start to resemble Gregor Samsa's incapacity to recognize what is staring him in the face. The mindset driving Gregor's dysfunctional take on his world means little within a STEM realm of concerns, but it becomes radioactive with meaning if we recognize in it a monstrous version of the subjective lenses that we wear in order to see our world at all. We wear these lenses, but we did not invent them. They testify to larger allegiances and animosities we've drawn on, often unthinkingly, to become who we are. As Nietzsche argues, no form of seeing is objective. We are willy-nilly shaped and shaping players in the picture of the world that we project out there, however much we might imagine it and ourselves to be objective and freestanding. Subjective allegiances run rife throughout every social situation. You might ask, what could Franz Kafka tell us about why subjectivity matters? Tolstoy or Toni Morrison, perhaps. They at least labor to get you to trust their representations, even to take heart from them. But what alternative to a STEM frame of priorities might Kafka offer? The answer I would propose is that his genius consists in getting us to recognize language as that deep social sea we spend our entire lives swimming in. In these opaque waters, none of us is a perfect swimmer. The medium is murky rather than transparent. languages laden with presuppositions, seething with others' judgments, tribal judgments. No narrative, no articulation of one's stance toward the world objectively states how things are. Perhaps this is literature's greatest gift, that it offers itself up not as truth, but as fiction. Nietzsche again, Plato versus Homer. That is the complete, the genuine antagonism. Plato would tell us what things essentially are, the objective truth that his philosophy claims, while Homer would show us what things look like, the subjective take on the world that his epics express. As fiction, literature generates versions of the real that ask not for belief, but for consideration. They invite us to consider them imaginatively for what they say, don't say, can't say. Literature knows it comes from somewhere, that its culture's values, interests, insights, anxieties are lodged in the picture of the world it delineates. Literature knows that interested and interesting are inseparable. Every important decision that you undergraduates will make in your life, like the ones you made in choosing your college, draw on subjective criteria. What size and makeup of the college's student body and faculty appeal to you? What disciplines interest you, stimulate your most creative thinking and feeling? And later, what work might you want to undertake once you leave here? Where do you want to live? With whom, if anyone, do you want to live? How do you make your 20s serve as a productive proving ground for who you'll end up becoming? How do you do this without deforming your 20s after all, into a mere launching pad for what will come later? These questions are both personal and social to the hilt. They are interested and interesting. Few questions you confront at this stage of your life count more than these, yet none of them submits to an objective answer. A focus on literature is often faulted as narcissistic and self-indulgent, but the more important truth is the opposite. Literature is where we take the human measure of pervasive social alignments and values, as these throb inside imagined characters encountering each other and themselves for good or ill, often for both. If, at least arguably, you grant that the two most resonant plays written in the West over the past 2,500 years are Oedipus Rex and Hamlet, you might note that both center on something far from problem solving. Of course, you could say that Oedipus is a proto-stem figure. He does, after all, solve the riddle of the Sphinx. Yes, but the play is after something darker than Oedipus's bright canniness. It insists on our and his coming to recognize beneath all his insight, his life-altering blindness. Oedipus, the problem solver, lives out all unknowing, a drama of impotence and power and impotence again, a drama actually encoded in the riddle of the Sphinx that he has solved, yet not grasped. This is the riddle of life's radical unpredictability in time. The undeveloped child crawling on 4 legs, the strong grown man standing on 2 legs, the fragile old man limping on 3 legs, his 2 plus a cane. Oedipus himself is all of these at different times, each identity contradicting the others. To see in Oedipus only the stem genius, the 2-legged riddle solver, is to see him wrong. Oedipus is no less the cast out infant who later comes upon and kills a man he does not know to be his father, and then marries that man's widow without knowing her to be his mother. Later yet, blinding himself as a self-judgment for his appalling misdeeds, he becomes the Cain-enabled old man at Colonus. The creature that walks on 4 feet in the morning and 2 in the afternoon and 3 at night, like the Danish Prince Hamlet, who has a new question for every answer he receives, a question that undoes the authority of the answer he has just received, is finally a figure of mystery. Neither hero has the key to the enigmas he embodies. Neither is finally a problem solver. Both reward all the attention we can bring to bear on them, for they shed light at once radiant and unbearable on the risks of being subjectively alive. You won't learn much about either in the world of STEM. I close by returning to Kafka. In his report to an academy, Kafka's ape appeals as a figure of accomplishment. At least he is, like Oedipus, in his problem-solving phase, standing on 2 feet. But Kafka, no less than Sophocles or Shakespeare, shows that the solver of solvable problems is more deeply the subject of unsolvable situations. An ape who has struggled to become human implies something more disturbing than anything that audience of exalted gentlemen would dream of considering. That is, the ape lives out with larger than life literalness, a drama that we humans struggle with throughout our lives. How to reconcile our inherited human bodies and natures with our mind's noblest aspirations. So yes, my dear members of this academy, your capacities for STEM-centered achievement are invaluable, and you would likely not be admitted here without already excelling in those areas. But do not imagine that you are therefore the same as those capacities. Do not ignore that you carry, each of you, unsolvable mysteries of self into the world that you inhabit. Do not ignore that you are mortal subjects immersed in ideological schemas you may largely take for granted, and that may largely take you for granted too. The STEM solver of problems deserves every accolade he or she receives, but that same solver once walked on 4 legs and may well end up on 3. You are more plural, more interesting and interested than you are likely to grasp. And you are neither innocent nor objective, never were, never will be. A recognition now and then of Kafka's ape and gigantic insect can be a salutary reminder. It might even constitute a necessary counterpart to Rollo May's I is the I of I can. Yes, you can, but unless you leaven what you can with a creaturely awareness of what you cannot, you will never solve whatever version of the riddle of the Sphinx is coming your way. A return to the humanities might help you glimpse that you have skin in every game you play. Such recognitions guarantee neither success nor happiness, and they make no promises about avoiding failure or heartache. But without reclaiming subjectivity, its bearing on all that you and others do, you will have missed an opportunity to catch up on and inhabit more richly the precious and passing life that is yours. Thank you.
Bravo, bravo.
So,
Thank you, Professor, very much for the talk. It's does reminds me a lot of question how I should spend the rest of my education, of how I or the question especially about how should I treat my training, whether it's a launching pad for something else, or how to evaluate the subject experience or balance my curriculum. I guess for this remaining part of the talk, we'll have Q&A session for anyone who are interested to ask any question to the professor. I would just be the one fielding any question, fielding people's questions. Oh yeah, it seems that Lee Cohen have a question. Okay, is that a hand? Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Weinstein. I've heard about your work before. I'm a senior at Swarthmore this year, majoring in philosophy, also studying art history and interpretation theory, and it's really a treat to hear this lecture. I've over my time at Swarthmore thus far, I've met with the provost and some administration to help bolster resources to the humanities on multiple occasions. But it's proved rather difficult to see many actionable steps taken to continue to support the humanities in determinate ways in faces of increasing student enrollment in other disciplines. And I think one of the difficulties in the way in which people approach advocating for the humanities is in terms of adding this very immediate sort of utilitarian dimension to them, that there are certain actionable skills that you learn in terms of being able to write well, to do whatever, or even the new moniker of STEM, and to throw in the concept of art as similarly immediately useful in the marketplace. And I wonder of your thoughts of how to advocate for the humanities, or is this mode of skill accumulation even a thing that we should think about in terms of advocating for the humanities on the institutional level? Thank you.
Thanks for those comments. I think they very clearly remind us of where we are. And addressing this issue is a lot harder than characterizing it. And I'm no expert. I can't prove any of the things I've said. I think that what's most missing is a sense for the fundamental dimension of subjectivity itself. It's not an option. Every one of these scientists, these would-be scientists, these becoming scientists, is also a subject. And these are the 4 years, it seems to me, in which they can learn more about that territory too. And if they don't, what they risk is going through life imagining themselves as merely problem solvers, or the other imagining that they do about themselves unaided by all that wealth of imagining that is the humanities. It's there as invitations to think about this human drama. What do humans create? What do they suffer? Where are their blind spots? Where is their vision? These things are none of them in the provable, solvable domain. And so what I think needs most to happen is not to propose some practical coefficient of the humanities as the sugar, the sweet that will bring them in, but to keep attempting in as fetching a way as possible to remind people that they are actually human beings and that their college experience is a qualitative 4 years, not just a matter of learning particular usable skills. They need to learn about who they are, what they carry into this game. The most appalling things done on Earth are done often by very bright people, unaware of their own alignments or at what cost those alignments are inflicted on others. Which is one of the reasons I went to Kafka for this talk.
I have a question, if I'm allowed. Are the old geezers allowed to ask questions? Hello, Professor Weinstein. You were my professor a long time ago. I want to say that I don't necessarily, and I was an English major, but I'm now a physician. And I want to say that I think I run a training program for psychiatrists, and I do research on the way the discrepancy between subjectivity and objectively measured emotional processing, actually. And it's a very interesting way that it gives rise to illness. But I want to say, from my point of view, that there isn't a discrepancy. The ability to be a really good scientist requires that one thinks about one's subjectivity, that one's life is enriched by understanding that and not taking and making silly assumptions. So I can tell you that as a person who admits people to medical schools and admits people to my training program, there's nothing better than a humanities major at Swarthmore College to come in, and I actually am training 3 of them right now. So perhaps my voice to Swarthmore College of the importance in every aspect of a humanities education, I don't know, as a STEM graduate, finally, maybe it could be helpful.
Thank you for that. I remember you well. It hasn't been that many years.
No, not too.
Maybe it has.
It has been a
Um, you would make more of a difference going back than I would, because you're lodged in very visibly for people doing STEM work. You're there. You're an achiever. Science matters for you. Objective things matter enormously. And were you to be able to let people help them to understand that this is not window dressing or icing on the cake, or isn't it nice to have read a book or 2 while you're doing diagnoses?
No.
But rather, these are also life and death awarenesses. And without them, we are foolish people. We make terrible trouble for others and for ourselves, that some of which can be avoided.
I will try to find a venue to say that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Speaking as a non-STEM person, I can say that the same concepts apply to other fields that are not just science. I've graduated from Swarthmore more than 40 years ago, spent more than 30 years as an attorney, and have spent the last 4 or 5 years trying to get out of the box of linear thinking, which I think that that is a part of what you're talking about here. And I'm most of the way done with a master's degree in organizational dynamics, and it's really interesting to see that over the last 30-ish years, there has been step by step an effort to add human emotion and subjectivity back into organizational dynamics. And a lot of the frameworks that I'm studying now in this master's program involve adding or reconsidering the role of subjectivity and human emotions in organizational life. So this is fascinating. And I want to thank you so much for this lecture.
Thank you. And what I would so love to see is this word to get out and to start to become persuasive in the 18 to 22-year-old cohort. America is unique in the world to have invented liberal arts education on this scale. No one else does it. Others start earlier. I mean, as brilliant as the British educational system is, you started with by the time of your A levels, you're already honing skills. So we actually imagined, and I think it's the glory of what we did, that 18 to 22 is a sustained attempt to learn a little more about selves and worlds before going into the serious business, and no one can say it's not serious, of making a living, of practicing something. But there's just so much more of our lives than what we do, what we practice. And college, if it's not helping to enlarge that dimension of being human, it's failing the students. You can't make them take these things. Requirements have limited value. And we have, Swarthmore never gave up on its requirements. We maintain them. But it's going to need a mindset that grasps some of the things that you were just saying, that it will be useful later. It'll be useful always in unpredictable ways. It's not a key that unlocks the door. It's a light that makes the room more interesting.
Hey, Phil,
Yeah.
this is Bob. I think you should find a co-conspirator in the Department of Admissions and just have this lecture, really this wonderful lecture, put in the hands of each of the freshman class coming in. Because you've really given them not just a syllabus for their four years, but a syllabus for life. And I think it would resonate, maybe understood better by people who've been through a bunch, but would resonate with any human being. And I think that's, rather than have to fight the administration over this requirement, that requirement, the real battle is in the minds of these young people coming into college. And it's just such a powerful lecture. Do that, one thing.
I like the idea, Bob.
We'll help, we'll lobby.
I like the idea.
Thanks for the suggestion. I just want to note that there's another student of Swarthmore who just raised his hand. I think Terrell. I think, are you muted?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Hi,
can't
Professor.
see you, but I can hear you.
Yeah, unfortunately, my camera isn't working today, so I don't know why, but thank you so much for this talk. It was really great to listen to, and some of the comments that you'd given earlier about how many of the atrocities in the world are committed by people who are really smart and just kind of studied STEM and ignored many of the subjective aspects is what has also inspired me to double major in computer science and philosophy. And on that note, I'm really interested in your thoughts about how we should navigate the way that you describe as how our tribal alignments influence us to choose the subset of information which allows us to sustain the prior alignment. And in particular, I'm thinking about the overflow of information and how the confluence of media, algorithms, and technology force upon us those exact subsets of information that we were inclined towards in the first place, and how that exacerbates that phenomenon. And I'm really curious about what is a thoughtful way to kind of navigate this subjectivity that we all have and to flourish within it.
Those are wonderful remarks, thoughtful, and I think maybe putting before us problems that at the least are difficult and may be insoluble. I've not talked about the technological explosion that gets us into the trouble. It helps to get us into the trouble we're in now, with a country being warring sides that don't understand each other and being nourished by the tribal feeds that keep reimbursing a set of views already held. And of course, the hardest thing in the world is to shed an empowering set of views that makes you feel not only stronger, but part of a group. You know who your compeers are. And I have long felt that it's a trap waiting for liberals to simply decide that those crazies out there need simply to get it together and they would see what we see. I don't think that's how the world operates. And I don't think 70 million people are crazies. And I think that the problem is that much more stubborn and complicated, in part for the reasons you've just suggested, that these social media feeds that are so virulent today, we seem not to know we seem not to have the political wisdom to know yet how to regulate those without violating First Amendment rights. I know a lot of people do worry about that, I don't know what the solutions are to that. This is not much help at all, but I try to remind myself once a week or so that I'm not innocent either. That to become a person at all is to be in a range of alignments that strengthen one's sense of self. And these aren't innocent alignments. I mean, they aren't sinister necessarily either, but we are in the social, and maybe that's the point I'd want to end with here, that we are in the social even when we think most we are in the individual. And that's why I went to poor Gregor Samsa's incapacity to know what is happening to his own body, because he's wearing the glasses fabricated by his workplace and his parents. It's only
Thank you.
partially responsive because you were asking, in a way, the harder question, which is, how does one work to make this a more manageable, a growth possibility rather than a hardening of one's alignments that are already in place?
Yeah, it's sort of a combination of that, and also kind of like sort of like this new mindset that I've kind of seen being adopted around this, is that people have started to also espouse the belief that like nothing is real, like nothing is true, and we can't do anything about anything. Anybody can argue anything, so therefore let's not have like any alignment or conclusions. So I don't know if I should call this like sort of like an information nihilism or something, but I'm wondering about how to like sort of stray away from that kind of like, let's just throw our hands up in the air because nothing makes sense, like nothing can be believed, when we do have this subjectivity. Like, how do we make good meaning out of it?
Well, there are a number of ways, again, super points, and a number of ways to respond. One is the response by way of STEM. The response, I remember in the last year or two, when someone was on one of the TV shows I watch, and he's a writer, and when he was asked, what do you make of this current distress, this attack on a scientific way of handling even COVID? And his answer was, what we're looking at is an attack on the Enlightenment. We are looking at a several hundred-year history in which we have respected and revered scientific points as not just any old claims in competition with others, but the most authoritative claims we have, and to be superseded only by better ones for which evidence is given. That I think that so that within one perspective, the kind of nihilism you're talking about, where everything is the same and so none of it matters and anyone can argue anything, the whole scientific project, its nobility is its refusal of that position, that there's better science and worse science. And I think any good course you take at Swarthmore involves better argument and worse arguments. There are always better positions and worse positions. Probably the mistake is to imagine that somehow there's any ultimate inalterable position that once one reached it, the problem is solved. It keeps changing, as it does in science, as it does in philosophy, as it does in literature. I remember as a graduate student studying literature, but going to an old professor's last course at Harvard on music. And it was a course for intro people, which is all I would have understood. And one of his first claims was, music doesn't get better, it doesn't improve, and it doesn't get worse. It's not in that schema of progress, but there is greater music and lesser music, and he believed that. And likewise for literature, I don't think it's all the same out there. So distinctions that are not ultimate distinctions, but qualitative ones that you choose by. And really, I think that's how an identity is formed, is by way of the distinctions that one makes at so many levels among different people. The ones you choose is the ones inside your world, inside you, and the ones not so. We make these distinctions always, and to concede the argument that because counter arguments can be made against all of them, therefore none of them matter, is to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, it is always a disputed space. That's when it gets serious. Back to interested and interesting. Positions are interested, but that doesn't make them not interesting. You pursue them for what they see. You don't make them godlike positions.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for the answer as well. I just want to remind everyone that there's an option of raising your hand, I think on Zoom. That way, it's just easier for me to see who wants to ask a question, because there are just too many screens for me to keep track of at the same time. But if no one's asking a question right now, I think I have a small question related to the talk. I think in the talk, we talk about the conflict between subjectivity and objectivity, but Torel talked about sometimes people nowadays are not even so concerned about objectivity anymore. I think it's all arguments or disputes. I wonder if sometimes what really is in conflict is a conflict between agency and subjectivity. People who compromise on their subjectivity, what they seek instead oftentimes is more power, more employability, the I as in I can do something. I feel if this conflict, has to be there, or I guess you can also say that subjectivity give one, there's really no conflict, subjectivity give one soft power. But I just wonder what one's perspective on this, since we do face practical choices as students about employability and stuff.
I'll start. I think that's really well said. And I've been talking about subjectivity as inalienable and ultimately irrepressible territory. It's where one lives. But it is not the same as what you're calling agency, nor is it the same as the ways in which you must shape yourself and marshal yourself for the positions in life that you seek. It's never about simply spilling out onto the world the dimensions of your subjectivity. I think probably also true, though, that if you shape the agential part of it with no regard for your own subjectivity, you're generating your own unhappiness. I was very lucky. I was able to be paid for doing this kind of work, so that for me, trying to figure out what I think about something and what I feel about it has been at the same time the job I have. But I respect the fact that this is not true of every form of work, nor could it be. And maybe it's as simple as this, that we live in plural worlds, and we need to keep them all alive, make them all as cohabitable and functioning as we're capable of. But that's an exercise in being alive and succeeding with yourself as well as succeeding in the world. That's exercise too, and it draws on your mind and it draws on your heart.
Makes sense. Thanks. I think it does take some bravery to follow your heart. And
the problem, if you don't, is that it's still your heart. Anyone who lies to themselves only half lies. One knows at some deeper level. This may not be true for everyone. I'm not trying to lay down some cardinal rule. But for the most part, I'd say to attempt a post-collegiate career in defiance of your feelings and your inner feelings and your inner priorities, if you didn't have to do that, that would be a mistake. To get them together in sync is the much more interesting challenge, or in sync to the degree that they can be in sync. You know, if you wake up at 3 in the morning, and this happens to older people more than your cohort, you get unwanted thoughts. And this is subjectivity coming back to bite you. And you need to end up making terms with that person you're going to live with longest, and that's you. And it's not available purely for instrumental purposes to be reshaped by whatever the outer challenge might be asking for.
Thank you. That's very very revealing for me, I guess. Is there any more question? Hi, I guess Mr. David or Rick, can you do you want to ask this?
Sure. Since there weren't any other takers, I'll take a try at it. First of all, the lecture was great, and I think everybody here probably agrees on that. And seriously think that those points Professor Weinstein ought to be you ought to continue to work with those and hone them in ways that can be made into some kind of policy actionable way, text. For an old-timer's view, which that's me, this has been a debate which in certain forms has been going on at Swarthmore since I was there, at least, if not before. The freshman lecture that I attended was given by C.P. Snow, who spoke about two cultures. There it was from the perspective of a scientist who felt that the STEM disciplines were underemphasized in liberal arts education at that time, and subject of a very interesting book that has a perspective that you might find interesting if you've never read it, called The Two Cultures. But what is a little dismaying to someone of my vintage is that the battle seems to have been going on at the expense of the humanities, even at Swarthmore. And I wonder, one, what your prognosis might be for the outcome, and two, I'll make a suggestion, which is that you've got a great target audience because at that age, people are interested in becoming happy in their lives, and they're thinking a lot about that. So rather than think, well, what's the most useful way to go from a vocational point of view, or what is the most artistic and humanistic way to go, what will bring me as a student in the long term the greatest personal satisfaction? And it seems to me it is a balance between those what are now divided into two worlds or two cultures. But anyway, I wonder on the first question, what you think the outcome might be at Swarthmore of this debate.
I left. I mean, students may be able to shed more light on that question than I can, because I left 5 years ago. I live on Martha's Vineyard, and I retired up here. When I came to Swarthmore, I'm exactly the same vintage you are. When I came to Swarthmore in 1971, English was the 3rd largest major, along with it was English and biology and economics. And and when I left, we still had great numbers, although the other languages had all shrunk, and now English has shrunk as well. And so it's still evolving. And I think it's salutary for you to remind us this debate is not new. Back in the day when Snow had to make that argument, it was being won on the other side, and that was unfortunate. And now it's being won on the STEM side, and that too is unfortunate. And to keep the more interesting challenge is to keep them in whatever sync makes sense for an individual's capacities and predilections. Capacities, really. What do you want to make out of this yeastiness inside you as you go on to fulfill a life? And I suggested earlier, you can't really, in the long term, cheat against who you are. So that one of my emphases tonight has been, your subjectivity is not going to go away. It stays with you. You want to recognize its contours. Even more, if you can recognize some of the company you keep, and maybe not all of it's going to be that welcome, but some of the company you keep to become yourself, that just makes you wiser. And I guess if there's one word that I'm pressing toward in this talk, it's wise. I think college is also about trying to become wiser. And that has to start with the sense that we don't begin wise. No one does. It's a lifelong activity. Part of it has to be self-confrontation in a serious, candid way. And that involves surveying one's own subjectivity. So a curriculum where the subjective dimension of all that we do is minoritized or omitted is cruelly lacking. It's no gift to those undergraduates to come away without it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor.
Lee had something more he wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to just ask one more question as well. And again, really just this discussion has been really, really wonderful to hear. As a senior at the college who's spent, the past 3 years doing kind of a really, my focus has really been in the humanities this whole time. I think a real question of hoping to find a life after Swarthmore in which one can not repress one's passionate subjectivity is something that's really important to me, and I hope important to a lot of people my age. But I think the issue is there's also a social dimension of what is the shape of life after Swarthmore and the shape of the world in which we enter, that where role consistency in accordance with the humanities and in accordance with one's own passionate subjectivity is a very hard thing to find these days. For example, my plan was to go to grad school directly after Swarthmore for philosophy and aesthetics, and yet, given COVID specifically, many programs are not offering admission to any students at this point. I guess half practically and in general, I mean, I guess what's the best sort of advice that you could have that the sense is that the world outside of Swarthmore isn't exactly tailored to an embrace of one's own, or rather to not negate one's own passionate subjectivity, and what advice you might have to finding some sort of consistent, healthy relationship with engaging with one's own subjectivity post Swarthmore in a world that might not foster that very directly.
I wish I had an answer to that. I can talk to it, but I don't have an answer for it because I can't see one. As I said, put a new light on what I said earlier. I was lucky. I said I was lucky that I've been able to spend my life being serious about these things. I was also lucky because the economy was such in 1971 when I got my first job at Swarthmore that the English department was growing, and there were many jobs that year in my field. So I didn't have to leave the academy. It's just initial candor to realize, to concede that that's no longer true. And then I think the task of keeping alive the best things that you've learned during these 4 years is your task, because they may not flourish in the easier way they flourished for me in terms of the outward objective positions I was able to take and be paid for doing. It's a more intricate negotiation you may have to go through. I guess the only dark piece of advice I would give is you can't afford to let this go. And afford as a figurative, in the figurative sense that for your soul you need it. And I don't think you will let it go. But the temptation will be, and this came up in Lissy's question too, the temptation will be to refashion yourself such that very dear dimensions of who you are get compressed, if not omitted. And I think that I don't think you can do it successfully, but were you to be able to, I do worry that it would come back to bite you. That at 21 or 2, you know deep and quasi-permanent things about yourself. The college should have helped you, and I hope it has, to know more about those things. There are many forms, many formats in which they can stay alive and be active and be the motor of your intelligence. But you may need to reconfigure. There's a pressure on you to be inventive and be inventive about your own life, such that the continuities that you've come to care greatly for, you don't try to drop them. And I think your challenge is to see that world of jobs out there as not invitations, and not necessarily invitations to forget these things or to tell yourself that you're entering a world where they don't matter.
Yeah, to add on that, I think you've got to be more than a job holder. You've got to be a human being. And human beings are not just job holders, they do other things. And there's an awful lot out there in the world that you can enjoy besides getting paid getting paid a salary for a job. You can listen to a Mozart string quartet. You can read Ulysses, which Professor Weinstein is lecturing to a bunch of us about. And Swarthmore gives you an opportunity to expand your horizons. And I would encourage you, I was a history major and a music minor. I would encourage you to spread your wings and not just focus on what you're going to make a living at, because you're not going to spend all of your time, I hope, at your job. And you're going to want to be an interesting person and be interested in the world around you.
Thanks, I like that, all of that.
Thank you both.
I totally agree. That was definitely a very thought-provoking question. I think there are 2 hands that were raised at the same time. I guess I would just go with Mr. Corkett first, because Mr.
Yes, I think that's me. I'd like to suggest a resource really helpful to the younger participants in this lecture. About 50 years ago, I had the privilege of spending a couple of weeks in a workshop with a man by the name of Richard Bolus, who wrote a book which was called What Color is Your Parachute? And at that time, it was a very best-selling, I guess you'd call it a job hunting manual. But it really was more than that. I think Bolus, more than anyone I've ever known, has integrated the objective and the subjective in the effort to find not only a job, but a life vocation. And he fully incorporated all the things that we talk about as skills. He analyzed skills into many different categories and helped you understand explore your own life history to understand what you really are good at and what you enjoy doing and what you take pleasure in doing and what you feel proud of. But he also fully incorporated into the whole process your your loves and your passions and your preferences and your ethics and your sense of mission and purpose and so forth. So it's a great resource, and I don't know if it's in print. Bolas himself died a few years ago, but sure it's available in the used book market. And I've used it with many adults in my work, and it's a wonderful resource. I think it's done a good job of bringing these two worlds together into a very process for finding meaningful work. And I think the word vocation also sort of incorporates those two worlds. It's more than just a job. It's something that gives your life meaning and purpose. And I think this has been a wonderful lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for those remarks. Thanks for the reference to the book. I don't know it, but it sounds like it's worth knowing. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Many years ago, Barry Schwartz gave a lecture at the college in which he distinguished between job, career, and vocation. And the job is just the money. The career is the long-term success in one's place in the social for which one is rewarded or not. The vocation is the calling. I mean, that's the Latin root of what you were called to do. And Barry, I thought very candidly said, we are lucky if we are in vocational mode. That's what we want, is to be called. I think in a way in the Latin behind education is to lead out the spirit, which seems to me to echo the sense of hearing a call, feeling a call, responding to a call. That's the spirit that is responding. And there are many ways in that social world of options that this can be done.
Thank you.
Thanks as well. I guess the next question will go to Mr. David Barak. I guess that's another raising hand.
I didn't know I was raising my hand.
I was just.
I can add one little thing to the last comment, to Lattimore's recommendation. There was around the same time, there was another career counselor who was very well known, Eli Jetta, and one of the founders of the then famous and unique Bernard Haldane Associates career counselors, which has since been replicated. Their methods have since been replicated thousands of times. But Jetta wrote a book following his one, which was simply vocational oriented, How to Get a Better Job, Moving Up it was called. But he wrote another one later that hits on more of these themes of leading a better life, a more fulfilling life, rather than just getting a good job, or the other side of the equation. It was called Now That I Know Which Side Is Up. And I'll put a reference to that in the chat bar. That's all.
Thank you. I guess I also want to call attention to the fact that this raising hand feature seems to be kind of difficult to find. Many people have told me that it's just hard to figure out how to raise hand in Zoom. Maybe that's just another example of how engineers do not care about subjectivity when they design Zoom. But I guess, but before—
There's a little hand thing you can do. There's a little thing you can do that raises a hand at the bottom of your screen.
You have to click on participants. If you click on participants, it will show in the bottom of the list there, raise hand. And that's how you do it. For people who haven't found it yet. There you go.
And we may be done. I'm not trying to get away.
Can I just say one thing, Phil, if I could jump in? Just to take your example, I would think a lot of kids leaving college this year or next year would feel a lot more like the bug, like the insect in Metamorphosis than Gregor. And it always was curious to me in that book, which I adore, that he wouldn't have woken up with the bug's mind, if he had, then the bug would be just fine because he would know where to hide, he'd know where to eat, he would know, but that intervening time where he had to learn bugness, you know, took him a long time. And I think when I came out of college, it was a little crazy for women because I went to an all-girl women's school after going to an all-women's school in high school. And I was a history major, and I remember one of my best history teachers counseling me and saying, "You'll make a fine elementary teacher." And I was going, what? I didn't even know if I liked kids at that time. But the demeaning message came loud and clear to me. So I became eventually a poet. But it just seems to me that Lee's quandary might be that of the bug versus Gregor, because you really are on, you're a lot like my son, who was an art major at
so then I'm attending a lecture conference thing. How I no, this is more important.
No, I just was sorry. Someone wanting to talk. But anyway, he eventually blended it. Was a wonderful biologist who died this year. It was his assistant because he was so allergic to the chemicals that were in the biologist's wife's laboratory that he had to find another job, and she helped him find that job, and it was fabulous. It paid well, and he's been happy in that science world, but he is a musician and he's an artist, and he has a kid, and everything in a small apartment in Brooklyn is working for him. It took a long time. I won't give you any more of the story, but it will be a long time before you come up so-called happy. But enjoy the bugness and figure out how he thinks and just make your way. But I love Phil's bringing that up today. It was very unexpected, Phil.
You're welcome, fan.
Thank you. I think people should feel free to jump in whenever they want. But I do want to call attention to Sharif Rolf. I think they messaged me earlier.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you everybody for putting this together. Professor Weinstein, that was a real pleasure. I just wanted to speak briefly about perhaps people's receptivity to ideas like this. And if you will all indulge me, there's just a brief metaphor. The best metaphor I've heard for the current pandemic that we're in, and I wish I could take credit for it, is one from the natural world. It's that of ants and what's called a spiral. Most insects, and ants in particular, navigate by smelling the pheromone trails of fellow ants in front of them while laying down the same pheromones for others to follow. And if the circumstances are just right, the ants can become a whirl of individuals simply walking in a circle because they cannot sense anything larger than what's immediately in front of them. And of course, they're governed by a rule sufficiently simple that they can be imprisoned by their own instinct. And they will walk in this circle until exhaustion. Now, it strikes me, as somebody who is in the field, and that many people in STEM fields, physicians perhaps most of all, will find themselves today in a position that they felt at least somewhat insulated from the world of the subjective, infinite involvements that define our lives, but turned out to be anything but. And I really do believe, now more than 10 years out of Swarthmore, that many professional people find themselves engaged in a work or a vocation or an institution that do practice or engage in patterns that are at least in part both absurd and inevitable. And, the last thing I'll say is that it seems that in this current moment, there's no question in times like the ones of today, people will be most receptive to new and radical ideas. And I think many people will emerge from this pandemic and hopefully engage in a reckoning, as though snapped out of some kind of a stupor, the kind that these same spiraling ants find themselves in. So it's just a thought, and I really enjoyed the conversation writ large.
Well, thank you. That was not only interesting, but elegant. I don't think, I certainly have said nothing radical. I mean, unless you go back to the sense of radical, its Latin root, meaning root. The kind of education I'm talking about is, I think I had that education. I don't think it is some sort of nostalgia. I think it is some version of that is what makes liberal education vital whenever it is vital. I mean, one can go through the ropes and requirements can just put you through the ropes. You can't make anyone think or feel, but you can make them more likely to do so by encouraging these things. We are all, not pheromones, but we are open to persuasion in so many different ways. So I would love to see the college remind 18-year-olds and those who are applying that as much as they are likely, they are all but certainly going to come out 4 years later better equipped to lead a successful life, and that includes materially successful too. That's not why they're there. That's not why they're there, and I don't think there should be shame or discomfort in saying that. It just needs to be, the college needs to find the ways to say that so that it does not sound elitist in the off-putting ways, but it does sound elitist in the sense that choices have been made. Elitist comes from the sense of something has been elected, and there are values at stake, and those are the ones the college, I think, at its best, has always taught.
Boy, are your books expensive.
No.
Yes, Becoming Faulkner, paperback, $29.
You'll pay that much for half of a dinner.
Where do you eat?
Nowhere these days.
Downstairs.
Boston restaurant? Yeah.
Well, I do second that. Textbooks are expensive these days.
This is not a textbook. It's paperback on Becoming Faulkner.
You should see how much the hardback cost.
Well, they don't have it. There's no such thing.
They're all at the libraries.
Yeah.
Not in my library.
Well, the Faulkner class was $700 and was worth every penny of it.
I have to say this, that I don't think there's anything cheaper on the market than books.
Well,
and whatever they cost, the amount of time, heart, learning, focus, and saying no to other pleasures in life that writing a book requires makes that $29 not a great price.
Yes,
not a high
sir.
price.
Yes, sir.
And the author doesn't get that price.
I don't get it. I get a piece of it.
I can only find one book by you on Amazon.
As someone who for one semester more has institutional access at Swarthmore, let me know, and I hopefully can get you something from McCabe sent. So
I don't
while I
live
have
there.
access.
I don't live there. You'd have to mail it.
Okay. I think we'll have another question for our current student to run. I think.
So there's one thing I was hoping to clarify about subjectivity, which is that there is sort of this like dual role that is being played, and that we have this like passionate subjectivity, but in many cases it's sort of like a precipitate of like the mirror and like as you put it, tribal alignments. And I guess I guess what I'm curious about with that is, given that like between, for instance, like you noted in like the 1970s, when sort of like the English department was like becoming greater, there were more like economically feasible opportunities. Given like the shifts from now to then, when we're sort of like raised with like a different kind of like mindset about how we should live, what kind of things we should prioritize, greater economic pressures that can affect people's reality as they grow up, that can also affect subjectivity, right?
Sure.
So,
Okay.
so sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I guess the end, like the sort of like end of like the question that I'm wondering about is, in that case, when these kinds of things like this, like stress, if I could like describe it in a word, can affect subjectivity, can it cause the like sort of like subjectivity in some sense to like go bad or like eat itself from like the inside by sort of like conditioning our subjectivity to things which work against its like more expansive and interesting nature?
I think it's all part of that mess that is our interiority. No one's interior takes the form of a regiment. It's not regimented in that way. We carry many different calls upon us that some of which we've internalized. You were talking about that there's some economic calls that you'd almost have to be deaf not to get their seriousness. And so you internalize them, but they come up against other commitments that are inside you. And these need to make a negotiation. You are the one negotiating these conflicting commitments or possibilities inside you. I think that's simply what it's like. The subjectivity is never an oasis. It's a space where what you've absorbed from the different kinds of environments that you've grown up in, starting with fundamental ones. We are creatures of endless absorption. But then what you do with those is you. You didn't choose them, but you have a major role in what you do with them. And from my perspective, you don't simply extirpate deep energies or deep calls that you've internalized and tell them to go away. The more interesting challenge is to find out how to make them compatible with other dimensions of yourself that you respect and that you do not want to see desiccated, dried up. And that this way of negotiating the different dimensions of subjectivity, that just is being alive. I mean, that sounds like a cop-out. I don't think it is. There's no formula for it. It's never over. It's actually a blessing that it's never over. How awful it would be if we were creatures of instinct, sufficiently so that the instinct would tell us everything about who we are. Instead, there is this open question of who we are, with all of these internalized on our body and in our minds, all of these internalized elements. And the drama of our lives is what we do with that. And it's not foreclosed, but it's not a picnic either.
Yeah, I guess as I was listening to the conversation that was happening earlier, I was kind of thinking about discipline and punish in particular, where like Foucault sort of like goes through like the entire like processes of subjectification and how that happens and like the history of it and how it's not just a prison, but it's society at large. And I guess what I'm thinking about is then how much like taking like that sort of like example that people like sometimes come up with, that like say someone like grew up in like the middle of nowhere and never talked to anyone, then they would have like very different like language and cognitive faculties. For example, if we lived in a world where our subjectivity was sort of like controlled and like modified from the very beginning, like sort of in a very like dystopian kind of way, do you think that subjectivity within us, that like more unique kind of interiority, would still be alive, or could it actually be completely squashed, or does it lie on this kind of like gradient or spectrum?
Well, the figure for total squashing is brainwashing. One of Foucault's critics, I think Discipline and Punish is his most interesting book. One of his critics, though, I think pertinently says, Foucault can explain everything but Foucault. he cannot explain the liberty, the unco-opted dimension of his own intelligence, so that he generates out of his mind a whole range of co-options from which he acts as though he himself is freed of them and able to see it as he wishes. It's a very powerful reading, and I must confess, seduced by it for about a decade, and then began to think that, well, it's true, our families are training grounds for us, as are many other things. But these are multivalent, training in the sense of what we can't do, but also training in the sense of what we might do. They are enabling and disabling. And we negotiate these. It's an extreme stance to argue that put together, they erase subjectivity as a space of choice and make it all a space of imposed assignments. It seems to me one can grant the real insight there, which is training is going on night and day, and we are infinitely open to it. But I don't see it following from that that will or agency is erased or merely another's creature. I can't prove that, but I think that I think most people lead their actual lives with a sense of, at least minimally, I is the I of I can do something, and it feels like a choice, and as opposed to carrying out a commandment. I don't have the last word on this, but Foucault's writings, I think, have been enormously useful for thinking about the penetration of social practices upon what we like to think of as subjective freedom. And the penetration goes far, but it doesn't seem to me that it ends up claiming all the territory and being able to predict where it would go.
All right, thank you so much. And I guess just one final question in that sort of line of thought to kind of like push it to its extremes. If we had something like 1984-esque or like Clockwork Orange or something like that, would you still believe that that stays alive, that I can way of living, like even in something that goes like well beyond like what Foucault is analyzing?
Well, what you've done is cite two texts that don't allow it, but that doesn't mean that's where we are. They are, both of them are utterly compelling because they are images of what we could become. I want to go back to a claim I made about literature earlier, that it's an invitation to consider rather than to believe. I think Orwell invites you to consider a social setup such that these things happen like that. And there's no more space of interiority that is free to do anything. Consider it. But if you're considering it, the assumption about being able to consider anything is that there is still space to weigh oppositions, to weigh options. And so that's why I think the two extreme instances that you've given, the film and the novel, are themselves powerful artistic statements that are warnings about where that can go, but they are not, it seems to me, blueprints for where we are.
All right, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. I guess I also agree that STEM sometimes are not as empowering, like as liberating your will, as people might, as they advertise themselves to be sometimes. But on a different note, is there any other question? Okay. I think Neil Gupta.
Hi. Hi. Thanks for the talk, Professor. I'm curious about your opinion on digital humanities and like the recent trend of literature and looking at literature from like an engineering perspective. And yeah, I would just love for you to say some stuff about that.
I have younger colleagues who are working hard on digital humanities and know 1,000 times more about it than I do. I think that there is an element of selecting and choosing that individuals go through such that it's never altogether materially provided to you what you need to know about a period. Let me give you an example. When the new Victorianists were underway, they were really hot about what the technology allowed them to know about the Victorian age. And they like to cite one particular powerful, important scholar named Walter Houghton, who wrote a book called The Victorian Frame of Mind. And for 50 years or so, it was a magisterial text. But some of these newer critics, younger critics, were saying, well, Houghton read maybe 1,000 books in order to arrive at his generalizations. But now, thanks to what the digital humanities make possible, we now have the 50,000 that were available. And I read that quote, and I remember what I noticed was this, that the young, enthusiastic Victorians never said, I can read 50,000 works, because no one can. No one can. And read 50,000 twice if you really want to get a responsible sense for what is at stake in them, even fewer. The number shrinks. So that the scandal is that we all move through our lives, all humanists move through our lives working with the books we do know, and then making the judgments that we can based on that. And I hope with a certain measure of humility, because what all of us have read pales in comparison to what we haven't. And that's true of any period. Most of it we haven't read. But what we can be is responsible for what we have and tread lightly on the generalizations that go the whole length. I think Houghton's work is not undone by this claim, and that being able to assess, you all read books, you end up assessing them. You don't have any digital data that tell you what to think of a book. How often have you read a book that's been highly praised in the Times or even won an award, and then you read it and you thought, well, there's not much going on here? Or you found one that is almost not talked about and it just spoke to you. That space still existed. I think it always will. I think maybe we've had it for a while. What do you think? This to Lizzie. Or is there more you want to do? I can stay up, but I don't want to just keep rehearsing the same kinds of things.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, we should run in circle. That's not.
It is 4:01 for what that's worth.
But
I couldn't believe, by the way, that we'd have an hour of this. I'm really impressed by that.
Yeah, that's much better than our conservative estimate of what's gonna happen.
Yes.
You're dealing with Swarthmore grads.
That's true. Okay.
So yeah. I guess if we have no more questions, I'll just end this talk. I'm very thankful of everyone who come and listen to the talk, and I'm particularly thankful to Professor Weinstein who prepared a paper and then a lecture for us. And I guess let's just give a round of applause for Professor Weinstein.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be able to do this. So I enjoyed it too. I hope you did.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You are all.
I mean, yeah.
Have a good weekend.
Have a good day, everyone.
Okay. I think Professor Weinstein has left. Then again, thank everyone for participating, and I'll end the meeting. I think right now I'll put up the recording of the meeting shortly online. Yeah, if anyone's interested.
Thank you.